Hello and welcome to our Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks Landscape Conservation Cooperatives webinar presenting the results of a project entitled A Survey of Landowner Attitudes and Conservation Practitioner Networks about Ecosystem Services in the GCPO. Today we will present final results of a three-part project that focuses on nature's benefits important to private landowners. The mapping part of the study was presented earlier this year and is available on our YouTube channel. Some background on the GCPO LCC. We are part of a national network of 22 landscape conservation cooperatives that cover the entire United States. LCCs focus on strategic conservation at a large or landscape scale that will be adaptive to future change. The GCPO focuses on a 180 million acre geography that covers all of Arkansas and Mississippi and portions of 10 other states centered around the lower Mississippi River. So right now I'm going to ask Toby to launch our initial question where we get an idea of who is in our audience. It'll just take a second for you guys to answer this poll. So we're asking you to
poll is up. Everyone would just check the appropriate selection.
And as you're answering that poll, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. Today I have the honor of introducing Robert Gralla and Chris Gralick. Robert Gralla is an associate professor in the Department of Forestry at Mississippi State University. He teaches forest resources economics and advanced forest economics both on campus and online. His research interests include ecosystem service monetary valuation, utilization of woody biomass for bioenergy, wildfires, and business clustering in the forest sector. He conducted the landowner survey portion of this project. Chris Gralick is an associate professor in the Department of Public Administration at NC State University and is primarily interested in institutions and the portability of governance systems. His recent research includes an evaluation of factors influencing individual participation in new markets and modeling of forest markets in response to novel energy policy interventions. He conducted the Practitioner network research for this project. So Toby, you could go ahead and give us our results.
Okay, it looks like we have a pretty good balance. Mostly university research scientists, some state and federal scientists, consultants, and outreach and consulting of any type.
So now you're going to close out the poll, and Robert, when you can get your presentation up, we're ready for you to start.
Okay.
So Robert, there we go.
Yes, Greg, thank you very much for this introduction. Hello to everyone in the audience. I'll be presenting today the results of our May survey study, and basically that study was related to landowner attitudes towards conservation activities and their willingness to participate in a conservation program. My co-authors include Dr. Jason Gordon here in the Department of Forestry, Kate Gralla from the Department of Geosciences, she's a research associate there, and Ram Dahal, he's a PhD candidate in the Department of Forestry. Now, we have a slight delay in terms of when I see my slides here on my computer and when the audience can see. So if you notice that there's a pause, it's not because I'm disconnected. I'm just waiting for that slide to show up on your screen so the audience can see it. As Greg mentioned, this study is a part of a larger project that was developed in response to a GCPO request for proposals related to evaluation and assessment of incentives for natural resource conservation management on private lands. And in response to that RFP, Mississippi State University partnered with the Duke University and developed a study with a title, Assessment of Ecosystem Service Value and Program Delivery Option. As a part of the study, we have developed three projects, and there were three separate reports that were associated with those projects. The survey of landowners in the GCPO area was conducted by Mississippi State University with cooperation with Duke. Concurrently, a mapping of ecosystem services was conducted by Duke University, and they also have used partial responses from the survey to further augment their analysis. And conservation program delivery options, which was basically social network analysis that was conducted by Duke University with cooperation with MSU, and Dr. Christopher Gallick, who is the next presenter, will talk more about this project. So as I mentioned in the study, we have attempted and we use a mail survey as a method to identify attitudes towards and the value of conservation activities. I have divided our presentation into 4 parts, where basically in the introduction, I'm going to talk briefly about ecosystem services. And later, I will present the study goals for the mail survey. I will discuss mail survey results. And at the end, I will offer concluding remarks. There are many definitions of ecosystem services, but the most simple one basically determines ecosystem services as any benefits that people derive from ecosystems or from the environment. And those can include a variety of ecosystem services such as biodiversity conservation, habitat for game and non-game wildlife, wetlands, pollinators, crop production, and timber production. Most of the time when we think about those ecosystem services, we think them in terms of a non-market ecosystem services, but some of them, such as crop production and timber production, have a price attached to them, and they are market ecosystem services. Now, those ecosystem services are typically categorized into 4 different categories, with which general public may be more or less familiar with. But provisioning services include food, water, and fiber. Regulating services include aspects related to climate, water, pollination, and diseases. Supporting services relate to soil formation, nutrient cycling, and cultural services relate to aesthetics, culture, education, and recreation. And I'm pretty sure that general public is pretty familiar with the recreation aspect of ecosystem services. Even though majority of ecosystem services are not traded on the markets, there have been many attempts to estimate their value. And it has been estimated that on an annual basis, a global value of ecosystem services is $145 trillion. And about $17 to $18 billion is a worth of ecosystem services in annual global transactions. And those transactions typically relate to a carbon sequestration. So we are talking about carbon credits, watershed management, and biodiversity. Those ecosystem services take place on 1 billion acres of a total land. That's slightly less than land area of the United States. And they take place on 324 million acres of a forest land, which is slightly less than half of a forest land in the United States. So even though I said that those ecosystem services, many of our ecosystem services are non-market ecosystem services and they don't have a price attached, there have been many attempts and many payment mechanisms developed to try to provide them at the full capacity of a land. Some of them include self-organized private deals. So this is when the private entity or non-government entity purchases a forest tract to protect a specific bird or animal species, or maybe provide wildlife habitat. Another mechanism involves public payments, payment mechanisms to private entities such as landowners. And we are very familiar with those. They include a CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, EQIP, tax reduction, and subsidies. Another payment mechanism involves open cap trading systems. One of the probably most known recently was a CCX, Chicago Climate Exchange, which is defunct now. Other payment mechanisms also involve offset projects such as wetland bankings, where developers can buy credits to offset their damages caused by their development projects. And also eco products, where some products are being marketed as environmental friendly or green products, and because of that they can command a premium price. So this study and mail survey had 3 distinct objectives. And the first one was to identify landowner attitudes towards conservation activities and programs. The second one was to determine willingness of landowners in the GCPO area to enroll in a conservation program that would provide or facilitate ecosystem services production. And based on that, we also used that to quantify a monetary compensation amounts that would be needed, that would be required by landowners to implement conservation practices on their private land. So our study was conducted in the region of a Gulf Coastal Plains Ozarks LCC, which is a land conservation cooperative. This LCC has 5 administrative units, and our survey focused on three of them, which includes the Interior Highlands, Mississippi Alluvial Valley, and East Gulf Coastal Plain. We selected those 3 to identify 3 distinctly different habitat types. And basically, in the East Gulf Coastal Plain, we have an open pine stands habitat. In the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, we have a bottomland hardwoods habitat type. And in the Interior Highlands, we have a grassland habitat type. The analysis was conducted at the zip code level, but can be also aggregated and conducted at other levels, such as those that would represent different levels of watersheds. And I have just realized that there's a gap between when my slides show up on my computer and when they are available to the audience. So our primary tool for collecting data was a mail survey, and we have invited 2,000 landowners in each habitat type to participate in our study. So we had 6,000 landowners in total. Those were identified by the private or commercial mailing list provider based on our selection criteria. And one of those was that landowners were identified not based on their mailing address, but based on where they have owned their land, and they needed to own land in one of those 3 administrative units representing 3 different habitat types. We have also used in each habitat type a different contingent evaluation method scenario. So those are basically hypothetical scenarios developed to quantify monetary value of ecosystem services or conservation practices in this case, and I will explain that a little bit later. We had 15 different payment levels that were offered to landowners, and they ranged from $1 to $200 per acre per year, and those were randomly assigned to each landowner. Since we had the 15 payment levels, we had 15 landowner groups in each habitat type, and within each group, we had 134 landowners. Our adjusted response rate was 33%, and it is comparable with other mail survey studies of landowners. So our survey questionnaire included 5 different sections. In the first section, we have collected information on landowner ownership, land ownership goals. And later we follow up with a list of environmental issues, and we ask landowners to indicate how concerned they were with those different issues. We have also asked them questions about their interactions with different agencies and institutions providing financial and technical assistance to landowners, and Dr. Christopher Gallick will be talking more about that. We also, in each questionnaire, we had a contingent evaluation scenario that was tailored to a specific habitat type. And again, I will talk about that a little bit more at the end of the presentation. And the last section of that of this questionnaire was social demographic information related to our landowners who responded to our survey. So I'm going to start with the last section and basically describe briefly or provide some characteristics related to our landowners. Their average age was 66 years. In terms of a gender, majority of landowners were male, 78%, and female landowners were 22%. Those 2 results are consistent with other studies, and they kind of related to 2 important aspects. Many researchers and practitioners indicate that basically a majority of landowners are of an older demographic, so in the future we'll be experiencing a change of ownership. And the real question here is whether the future generation of landowners will have the same land ownership goals, whether they will change, or whether there's going to be increased land parcelization. In terms of a gender, this is also an important aspect because studies over time and many times show that male landowners and female landowners have different attitudes to environmental issues, with female landowners being more concerned about those issues and being more willing to implement measures that would help mitigate those issues. 71% had some college education or higher. 50% of landowners didn't belong to any professional organization that would help them enhance their ownership goals. and average household income was almost $82,000, which was higher than national average, reported by the U.S. Bureau of Census. In terms of ownership, respondents, landowners who responded to this survey and provided their responses owned slightly more than 400,000 acres. On average, they own 197 acres of forest land and 194 acres of agricultural land. In terms of which type of land category was prevalent in each administrative unit, in terms of East Gulf administrative unit, that was mostly forest land. In terms of Mississippi Alluvial Valley, the ownership here was evenly split between forest and agricultural land. In terms of interior highlands, most of the reported land was agricultural land. As you can see, this map shows basically the distribution of total owned acreage, which includes both forest land and agricultural land across those three administrative units. We have developed about 100 maps that illustrates each questions and responses to those questions and shows the landowner preferences. I won't have a time to show all of them here today, but all maps are available in our final report that has been submitted to the GCPO and will be available online. Again, waiting for the slide to show up on the audio screen. This slide shows you a distribution of different habitat types, and you can see that most of the time landowners reported that specific habitat types would cover less than a quarter of their land. So that was from 1 to 25%, and there were only few landowners who would report that one specific habitat type would cover majority of their owned land. This slide shows you ownership reasons and how different reasons, what role and how important they were in ownership of the land. So you can see here that we have several different reasons, and many of them have received very high ranking. That was a 4 on a 1 to 5 scale, which indicates that basically personal education, healthy soil, clean water, visual appearance, and wildlife habitat had a high priority in land ownership. Long-term investment also was ranked as a high priority. Family tradition and legacy were important too. Implication of that is that landowners care about how their land was managed in the past, and most likely they care how that land is going to be used in the future. Also, another implication here is that landowner owned their land for a variety of reasons. Some of them, such as long-term investment, was basically mostly profit-oriented, but there was also a lot of other reasons that were non-profit-oriented, such as personal recreation, healthy soils, clean water, visual appearance, and wildlife habitat. And what that might indicate that those landowners might be more likely to implement conservation practices on their land if they are provided with some technical assistance. Just for your information, before we implemented a mail survey, we also have implemented an online survey of professionals in the GCPO area to see if they have the same preferences and opinions to those questions that we are asking landowners, and see how those compare with each other. So you can see here that professionals were asked to say how specific ownership reasons were important to landowners, and for some of them, such as personal recreation, healthy soils, and long-term investment, they assigned the same importance levels. But for other ones, they have assigned a lower importance level, meaning that there is some disconnect in terms of what professionals think is important to landowners in terms of land ownership and what landowners think about that. From my perspective, being aware why landowners own the land is going to be very crucial in being successful in implementing conservation practices on landowners' land, especially if those practices enhance their ownership goals. This slide shows you the landowners' concern with different environmental issues. These concerns were ranked on a 1 to 5 point scale, with 1 being not at all concerned and 5 extremely concerned. And you can see that those are not all issues that were listed in the questionnaire, but the most important ones. You can see from that the drinking water quality was by far the most concerning environmental issue, and it was followed by drinking water quantity, chemical drift, insects, invasive species, soil erosion, loss of forest, farmland, and open space, loss of habitat, and loss of pollinators. Some other environmental issues such as overgrazing, water quality, or quantity for irrigation and recreation, landowners were not so concerned with those. Now, what you will find very interesting that professionals had slightly different opinions, and in some cases, such as drinking water quantity, they had the same opinion as landowners, but in other cases, their concern was 1 or 2 points lower than those of landowners. There might be several explanations for that. One of those might be that landowners think about those issues more in terms of a local scale and their land, and professionals think about those issues more in terms of a large scale. Nevertheless, being able to recognize those environmental concerns and being will help to implement conservation practices on landowners' land, because landowners will be more willing to implement those conservation practices, especially if they address their environmental concerns. We have also had questions related to the interaction of landowners with different organizations that provide technical and financial assistance. And there were 2 striking results here, that landowners almost never contacted those agencies for any help. And of those organizations that we have listed, county and university extensions were more frequently contacted, but even those 2 organizations were reported as, landowners reported that they contacted those agencies very seldomly. So there are 2 implications of that landowners are missing on some opportunities regarding the resources that might be help them to manage their land better. And also many programs are missing the large portion of their potential audience, and that probably limits their ability to implement some of the conservation practices that they would like to limit. In terms of landowner satisfaction, landowners most of the time reported a medium satisfaction level on a scale from 1 to 5, but there were some programs that were highly ranked in terms of satisfaction, and those are programs such as CRP, EQUIP, NRCS, Firewise, Landowner Management Services, Farm and Fish. Those are well-known programs, and perhaps those programs could be used as a platform to try to disseminate information about benefits of other programs and try to get landowners to get engaged with those other programs that have received lower rankings and also that were less frequently contacted by landowners. At this point, we don't know if landowners' low level of satisfaction is based on their previous experience with those programs, or simply because landowners are not necessarily aware of the benefits that those programs offer. Dr. Christopher Gralik, in his presentation, will be talking more in terms of landowner interaction with different organizations and perception of professionals, how frequently landowners interact with the organizations, and he will explain what those results mean. So now I'm going to turn to the contingent evaluation method that basically is an approach used to value non-market services. You might be wondering how we can put a value on those non-market services since they don't have a price attached. And one way to do that is to create a hypothetical market that would describe ecosystem service, and based on that, see how much landowners would require to provide those ecosystem services, or how much public would be willing to pay to ensure that those ecosystem services exist in the future. There are 2 approaches that can be used here: willingness to pay and willingness to accept. And willingness to accept is the approach that we have used in this study. So basically, the first hypothetical valuation scenario involved a loblolly pine stand, and we asked landowners to assume that they own 50 acres of a loblolly pine stand, and that they were planning to harvest that stand in 2015. That was when the survey was implemented, and that was a business as usual alternative. They were offered an option to enroll into a new CRP program that would facilitate provision of ecosystem services. And if they enroll into that program, they would have to delay harvest by 10 years from year 2015 to 2025. We had also some other stipulations that in detail describe to landowners what this program was about. Program description or scenario description was followed up by the willingness to accept question. Would you enroll your 50-acre open pine stand tract into the conservation program described above if you were offered an annual payment of X dollars per acre per year for the duration of 10-year contract? And in this question, landowners were assigned a randomly selected payment level. Based on a further statistical analysis, we have determined that on average, landowners would require almost $128 per acre per year to enroll in a program like this one. 28% of landowners were willing to enroll in the conservation program that would facilitate ecosystem services in the open pine stand habitat type. You can see here also a result of our follow-up statistical analysis. We have looked at different independent variables that would allow us to determine whether landowner was likely or not likely to enroll in a conservation program. You can see that in the model here for the open pine stand hypothetical scenario, in this case only a bid, which is a compensation amount, was statistically significant, and we would basically what it means, the higher was the compensation amount, the more likely landowner would be to participate in the program. Our second contingent evaluation scenario involved bottomland hardwood habitat type, and in this case we asked landowners to assume that they own 50 acres of a 55-year-old stand. The rotation age was higher because hardwood stands require different management activities, and they have a different growth. And we also asked landowners to assume that they were to harvest that stand in 2015, and they were offered an opportunity to enroll in the CRP program. Again, they were explained that under this program they would have to delay their harvest by 10 years from year 2015 to year 2025. We follow up with the willingness to accept question and determine that on average landowners would require $150.30 per acre per year to participate in a program like this one. And in this case, only a quarter of landowners were willing to enroll into this program. Now, on this slide, you can see the results of our more detailed statistical analysis, and basically those independent variables highlighted in green indicate a variable statistically significant. And you can see that here compensation amount reflected by the bid level and the presence of a grassland habitat type had a statistically significant impact on whether landowner was willing or not willing to enroll in a conservation program. I'll be moving now to the final grassland contingent evaluation scenario, and you can see that now on the screen. This scenario is slightly different because grasslands are managed on an annual basis, and basically what we have asked landowners to assume that they own a 50-acre parcel of a grassland, and they had an opportunity to enroll in a new conservation reserve program. And that scenario was modeled after the newly established USDA CRP, grassland CRP. And under these programs, landowners were not allowed to convert grassland to other uses such as crop production. They also might be restricted in some activities during the bird nesting season. However, they could do grazing, they could harvest hay, and they also could harvest seeds, put fence, and put also fire breaks. Under the program, they would be required to preserve this grassland for 10 years from year 2015 to year 2025. And we follow up with willingness to accept question and determine that on average, these landowners in this habitat type would require the highest compensation level of $166 per acre per year. and 29% of landowners were willing to enroll in a program like this one, and that's at 29% at all payment levels. Just to give you some perspective how this compared to currently offered payment levels, CRP currently offer different CRPs, different programs. They offer initial sign-up incentive of $150, which was increased from $120. Additionally, depending on a CRP program, as a landowner, you can receive rental payments that can be as high as $100. And in addition to that, landowners might be eligible for a cost to pay to offset the cost of initial cost of practice establishment, and there are also additional cost share payments that are available to landowners. So, Toby, I am ready now for you to release a first question. And I'm going to move to the last, second to the last slide. This is a table that shows you different independent variables and whether they are likely to increase or decrease probability that landowner will enroll in a conservation program facilitating preserving grasslands. And you can see that we're able to here identify more independent variables that played a crucial role in that probability. Compensation level, presence of a pine habitat type, presence of a hardwood, bottomland hardwood habitat type, and profit motivation had an impact on whether landowner was likely to enroll in a conservation program or not. And also education level had an impact too. In terms of conclusions, what we have, and I'm again waiting for the slide to show up. I see Toby's question right now. Hey, Toby, I can still see the multiple choice slide. Just making sure that we are still waiting to collect responses.
Toby may still be muted. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll in the interest of time.
I'm sorry, I was muted.
So it's roughly split between likely and neutral. Looks
okay.
Like. Do you mind if we go ahead to Chris, Robert?
I just have one more slide that will take you about 15 seconds.
Okay.
So I would like to offer you a concluding remarks. Basically, what we have done, we have determined that landowners owned land for a variety of reasons, and some of them were profit motivated. Majority of them were non-profit oriented land ownership reasons. Ecosystem services played an important role in land ownership. However, landowners didn't utilize available program resources, and based on that, they might be missing on some opportunities to utilize those resources and improve their land management. What that also means that we may have to customly design some of the conservation approaches, especially to enhance land ownership goals, and this way encourage landowners to participate in those programs and implement conservation practices on their land. Our analysis, especially in terms of maps, will help outline areas that are most suitable for large-scale conservation activities, and also identify those areas that are most likely to succeed in those conservation practices. We have also determined that landowners will require some landowners will require a monetary compensation to engage in the conservation practices, but those compensation levels are consistent with the current CRP payments. And also, the average contingent valuation estimates that we have generated in the study can be used by GCPO and other agencies to quantify budget necessary to implement large-scale conservation efforts. So with this, I thank you very much for your attention. And Greg, now I'm ready to turn the screen to Christopher.
Great, thank you very much. I'm handing it over to you, Chris. I think if you're talking, Chris, I think you're muted.
I was not talking, but I am now. I assume that I'm being heard. Thanks, Greg. Thank you also, Robert, for the lead in there. Again, Christopher Gallick, currently at North Carolina State University, was previously at the Nicholas Institute. I'd like to thank U.S. Fish and Wildlife for the support to do this work. As Robert said, and as you may have heard in previous presentations, this is part of a broader program to assess ecosystem service support and delivery in the GCPO LCC region. The portion I'm going to be going over is largely consisting of a network analysis that stems from some of the surveys that Robert described. The title of the talk is Conservation Program Delivery in the Southern U.S., Preferences and Interactions. It's also the name of a paper that was just published last week in the Journal of Environmental Management. I'll have the citation to that at the end of the slide, at the end of the presentation, rather. Okay. So again, trying to be mindful of any delays here. Apologize if there are any delays between where the slides are and where I am. I'm not going to wait for any slides to catch up in the interest of time, but hopefully the delay is small enough. Okay, so I think it's important to recognize that, and this is kind of the more straightforward slide-based part of the presentation, a little more background material. But I think it's important to go back to sort of the motivating factors here. One is that it's been recognized that a challenge of ecosystem-based planning is translating broad conservation objectives to practices on the ground. You have your landscape level targets, but trying to implement those, especially in an area like the Southeast, where you have a lot of land held by private landowners and land managers, requires translating these broad objectives into discrete management-based practices that you can then somehow coordinate against a number of users. And that remains a challenge. Obviously, it's a difficult undertaking. What is also complicated is that designing programs for these, to deliver these programs and practices to these landowners is likewise complicated. You have research that shows that it's not only what's in the programs, but how it's delivered that matters. For example, the incentives provided. Are you providing cost shares? Are you providing direct grants, technical assistance? What's the entity administering the program? Is it NRCS or Extension or FSA or Fish and Wildlife Service? Is there an established relationship there between the potential users and the entity that's delivering the program? And also the networks of past and potential participants. Have they engaged with each other? Have the landowners engaged with each other? Have the conservation practitioners engaged with each other? Is there an existing set of relationships that can be built upon to deliver this new, more expanded program? Social network analysis, or as I'll call it here, network analysis, is well suited to explore conservation program design and delivery questions like these. And even though it's been used quite a bit in natural resource management, it's been used less in conservation planning or evaluation of management outcomes specifically. And that was sort of the motivating factor in our work. Okay, so breaking down quickly study objectives and research questions. So we looked at interactions with conservation practitioner organizations and landowners, as well as interaction patterns of conservation organizations themselves in the GCPO LCC region. So taking data from the landowner survey that Robert described and seeing who landowners were working with, which organizations. And likewise taking the online survey that Robert alluded to that looked at who were the organizations themselves working with, what was their network of collaborators and colleagues. There are essentially two primary research questions. One is, what type of practitioner organizations are most and least central in the practitioner network? Are there certain organizations that can play a so-called gatekeeper or coordinator role in implementing these landscape level programs? And also, and this stems from that, which organizations within the network are turned to most often by those landowners who are the ultimate recipients of programs in the area? Is there a quote-unquote favorite face of this work? Are there favorites among the landowner community for whom they would like to be working with? Because when you assess the relationships between conservation organizations and the relationships between landowners and those organizations, that can help provide insight into whether there is a particular entity that is perhaps best suited from a coordination standpoint and also best suited from a delivery standpoint to be leading these new or expanded or even modified conservation programs. Okay, so briefly in the study methods, and I apologize, I am going a little bit quicker than I would otherwise, but I want to make sure there's time for questions and answers, plus time to actually get to the data, what we actually found. So we undertook a dual survey approach. One was the online survey that was targeted to key informants from conservation organizations. I think it's important to note that we didn't survey everybody and every organization that is working in conservation in the GCPO LCC region. Rather, we looked at those who were able to speak to, owing to their experience or the positions they held, to be able to speak for those organizations, and particularly who they worked with, what sort of programs they were already involved with, et cetera. And the other one was based on the mail survey to landowners that Robert just spoke of. A few definitions that I should go over because I'm going to be talking about these briefly in the next couple slides. One thing that we looked to were interactions between conservation organizations, both between landowners and organizations as well as those organizations themselves. And these are called ties between nodes. So a tie is the interaction, and nodes are the individual organization in question. The term degree represents the number of connections. Okay. Tie strength, in addition to actually assessing the presence absence of a tie, you can also look at how robust or strong is that tie. Tie strength here is measured as the frequency of interaction with conservation organizations, ranging from never to often, with a couple gradations in between. And that provides an indication of relationships with outsized collaboration potential. We have something called average path length, and that's the average distance between two nodes. And it provides an indication of how easily information can pass through a network. For example, if A and B are connected, then that makes it very easy for information to pass between them. If you have a third node, say node C, and it's not connected to A but is connected to B, then that information has to first travel to the second node and then to the third in order to reach its endpoint. As you get to have a higher average path length, that speaks to a less well-connected network. As you get to a lower average path length, that is an indication of a more well-connected network. And finally, this notion of betweenness, which mathematically speaking is the sum of the proportion of shortest paths between two nodes that pass through a third given node. It provides an indication of the relative connectivity provided by an organization, a particular entity. So how well is that one node connecting other components of the network? Now, this is useful for testing things like, is there a particular organization that is better suited to act as a coordinator in the broader work that's being done among other organizations? Okay, briefly getting into a little bit of the findings here. So one of the things we wanted to do is to say, who are you working with? And that's what's shown here. And this is split by both landowner and conservation organization surveys. So on the rows, you see the different organizations and organization types that we included. We had hoped to have specific organizations. Some of these you'll notice are aggregated into like local conservation group or industry organization. In many cases, the survey respondents didn't provide the detail requested, and so we had to aggregate some of these in order to be able to capture it. I was also not able to use a lot of these because of that in the network analysis, because you have to maintain the same level across all of your different organizations. I couldn't have some be specific and some be aggregated into more generic groups. But for the purposes of these sort of general sort of background numbers, we can use it. And what you see here is a couple of themes. One is extension is fairly popular in both landowner and conservation organization surveys. But there's also some differences. For example, comparing, say, industry organization in terms of proportion of total ties reported in the landowner survey is very high, 17%. It's the most reported, but is much less so, only 9% in the conservation organization. The flip is also true for local conservation or the same is actually rather, also true for local conservation groups, high in the landowner and relatively low in the conservation organization. So there's some differences just in terms of the number of ties reported. There's no statistical analysis or network analysis on this, rather it's just sort of kind of raw percentages. So, once you see maybe there might be something going on here. Well, one of the questions that we asked was in the landowner survey, who are you working with? On the flip side, we also asked conservation organizations, who do you think landowners are working with? And in theory, these should be the same. If conservation organizations had perfect knowledge of who landowners were working with, they would be the same. But what we find is that there's quite a few differences here. In some cases, say extension, state agencies, and NRCS and FSA, conservation organization respondents reported a higher frequency of interaction. And I should note this is based on frequency of interaction, 0 representing never, 4 representing always. Industry organizations, however, was the opposite, where landowners reported a higher rate of interaction than conservation organizations believed were the case. And so this shows that there might be a disconnect within the conservation organizations of who the landowners are actually working with. Okay, so this brings us to the network analysis itself. Now here's a network graph showing all interactions for surveyed conservation organizations in the GCPO LCC service area. Now the nodes are sized by betweenness, with the larger size representing a higher measure in that case, and the ties are actually weighted by interaction frequency. And so what you see here is that NRCS and Extension, the two largest nodes here, are potentially best suited for taking on this coordinating role within the network. You also see that there's a lot of heavily shaded lines, which indicated that there's a lot of frequency of contact between these members of this network. And another thing to note is that the path length here is 1.1, which represents a very well-connected network. It shows that almost everybody is connected to everybody else. Now, what this generally indicates is that diffusion of information, new ideas, innovation is well supported in networks like this, because you're able to communicate very freely. Ideas and information can bounce around fairly easily. What it doesn't allow as well is coordination, because you don't have a particular organization that is the gatekeeper to information, that is in a position naturally best suited for this coordinating activity that you might want to see in landscape level conservation, where you're trying to, again, coordinate all these disparate activities and programs to deliver them to users in the field. Now, if you just take the most frequent interactions, say often or always, so looking at those organizations that work with each other most often, and you focus on those, you get a slightly different pattern. In this case, your state agency starts to play more of a prominent role, although Extension still shows up. It's much more sparse. You get a lot of these other organizations falling out, and the path length does increase slightly to 1.6. Still a fairly well-connected network, all things considered, but you do start to see some of these changing patterns. Now, this is a very, very, very brief overview of sort of a complex analysis. But again, given the time, I'd much rather have times for questions than to show slide after slide. But just to reiterate, I think the unspoken motivation, in addition to what we talked about on the first slide, was that communication forms the basis of landscape level conservation program implementation and administration. You need to be able to get these ideas out there, to communicate what you need and where, and to be able to do so effectively with the landowners who are ultimately going to be the recipients and doers of this activity on the ground. Now, in trying to assess who is best able to do that, what we find is conservation organizations report a wide range of interactions with other organizations, suggesting a well-connected network. Again, this is really good for the diffusion of ideas and innovation, but less well suited for coordination, something that needs to be paid attention to in future work. Landowners generally report more interactions with non-government entities, whereas conservation practitioners report more interactions with government entities. And there might be a potential disconnect here in terms of who is working with whom, as well as the organization's understanding of who is working with whom. One thing I didn't go into in the presentation itself but want to flag here is that almost a fifth of total landowner respondents didn't indicate a working relationship with anybody. And so there's a sizable part of the population that is falling outside of this that could represent new opportunities for cooperation and collaboration. And because of all this, continued efforts to coordinate activities could benefit ecosystem level planning and program delivery in the region. Not surprising conclusion, but one that is actually reinforced by our findings here. So with that, hopefully we have some time for some questions. I have the citation here for the paper that just came out last week. Again, it was in the Journal of Environmental Management, as well as some of the other papers that I cited throughout here in the background. My contact information is listed. If you're having any difficulty accessing the paper or would like a copy, please reach out to me and I'd be happy to provide one.
Thanks very much, Chris. Right now we have one person in our audience who has raised her hand, so I'd like to encourage any of you, if you have questions, to raise your hand, use the raise hand function, or ask a question. And this question is coming from Elisa Coffin, and I'm going to try and unmute you. Are you there, Elisa?
Oh, hi. Actually, I was just wondering about the social network analysis software that you used. Which program did you use for it?
Yes, so it was UCI NetDraw.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. What was it?
Sorry, UCINet was the analytics software, and then NetDraw was what I used to to do the graphs.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? I'm sure there must be some questions. I had one for you, Chris, and it goes back to earlier when you were going through the definitions, and you were talking about one of them was, I can't remember exactly what the term was, but it was number of connections, and you mentioned that somebody that a low level of connections might be indicate a high degree of potential for collaboration, but it was unclear in the way that you put it whether you were saying if people are already really connected, if that indicates a high degree for collaboration because there's higher trust already, or if you're saying when there's not a high degree of connection that you can do work there to create more collaboration.
Right, there's a couple things going on there. I think what you're referring to is average path length, where you're talking about how well connected is the network. And this just goes back, this is leveraging some previous findings in the literature. It's not something we explored here, but rather leveraged what it was done otherwise, some earlier research, was that when you have a very well-connected network where everybody is connected to everybody else or something close to that, it's very easy for information to pass around that, right? If I want to get information from, if I know you and Toby and Robert, and I want to get something to Toby, I can just go there directly. I don't necessarily have to interface with you or Robert to do that. If, however, it is a less poorly or more poorly connected or less well connected, kind of getting my double negatives here, not as well connected network, and I'm only interacting with you, then it requires you to be more of a coordinator to make sure that that information gets to where it's going. So if I say, can you please pass this to Toby, and Toby's saying, could you please get this to Christopher, that puts you in a very good position to be coordinating these activities, or to be perhaps limiting or facilitating. And so what generally has been found in the past is when you have these very well-connected network where everybody talks to everybody else, ideas pass very, very easily. Innovation is possible. You get a lot of people talking to each other. But in terms of coordinating activities, it's much more difficult because you don't have one entity sort of calling the shots. You have a lot of cooks in the kitchen, or whatever other metaphor you want to use. And so it's just a much more diffuse, disaggregated decision-making process, I guess would be the way to go. Now, in terms of better managing that, there's a strategy called network weaving, where you can actually try to change the dynamics of the network, and this is sort of a loose way of putting it, but sort of change the dynamics of the network to better achieve the outcomes you're trying to get to. That is something that's discussed in literature. In practice, it can be difficult because, again, these are based on relationships. And so telling somebody to communicate with somebody isn't always an effective strategy in and of itself. And so one of the things that we talk about in the paper is, using things like the blueprint that's being developed, using opportunities to bring people together to allow those relationships to form organically is perhaps a better way to go about it.
Thanks. We have another question from Mara Omega. And Mara, I'm unmuting you. Are you there? Well, I don't hear her right now. She says, might we see, and this is a question for you, Chris, might we see more SNA research on conservation organizations from you in the future?
Thanks for that question. I'm not anticipating it. This is not a focal area of mine, at least the network analysis. It's always, I think it's an interesting tool, but I don't have anything on tap at the moment.
Okay, and then there's another question from Michael Bezold, and he seems to be muted, so I'm just going to read his question. He says, has ecosystem services been considered in NRCS or other federal incentive programs to date, or been considered in the Farm Bill? Or are there existing incentive programs successfully used in the Northwest, Oregon, or Washington, or elsewhere? So I think he's talking about ecosystem services, specifically how they've been considered in a lot of the NRCS and federal incentive programs or in other places.
Yeah, if I could jump in there, this is Christopher. I think examples like the the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, NRCS, I believe runs, things that are explicitly targeted to landscape level work, but also things that are more practice-based. And this is kind of the motivating factor in some of our analysis, and are some of the programs that we actually include in the surveys, things like EQIP and other things that may be more field-based or practice-based, but collectively, when you aggregate those up, may have landscape level implications. So I think there's two ways of looking at it. One is these top-down sort of regional approaches and some of the new programs that were in, I believe it was the last Farm Bill, but also how do you aggregate these individual field-based practices up in a way that achieves these landscape level impacts. But the short answer to the question is definitely there, whether it's through cost share, technical assistance, direct grant, through things like CRP, there's definitely ways to achieve this. The question is, how do you design the program in a way that you actually get the landscape level impacts that you want to get out of the back end?
Right, and I have one more question here. Probably we have time for this one. This is from, Honora. I'm not going to even try and say the last name. Can you hear us? You're unmuted. Okay, I don't think she wants to speak up either. She just says, did you see geographic state differences in your responses? I'm not sure whether this is for Chris or for Robert. Maybe both of you could respond.
Hey, this is Robert. Yes, we did geographic variation in responses, both in terms of interaction, value of ecosystem services, and preferences. Not for all of them, but for some ecosystem services, we have seen substantial differences.
Chris?
Oh, sorry about that. I'm trying to recall. It was a part of our earlier analysis on this. I believe it was fairly consistent in terms of responses. I think there were some differences, and I apologize, I'm not better equipped to answer this right now. All I remember was that from an analysis standpoint, we were comfortable that we were consistent enough across the states to proceed. I can look that up. If there's information or additional answers that I can provide, please do send me a note, and I'd be happy to give that to you. I don't want to go through my files right now since I'm on the webinar and be rooting through my files in front of everybody, but I can get that information.
Okay, well, thank you. We're at 2:01, so I think it's time to finish up, but everybody who registered for this webinar will receive a link to the recording, and I will also try and include a link to the paper that Chris had just published, and any other final reports from this project that are in our project database. So thank you everybody for attending today, and thanks for our two presenters.